I'll be on my the camera.
Yeah.
Sorry.
All right. Looks like everyone is in and we are live on Facebook, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Allison and I'm part of the education department at the Timken. We're really excited to have you with us for our monthly installment of these lectures. Just before I begin, I want to go over a couple kind of guidelines, just some housekeeping. So we do ask that you remain muted through the duration of the tour, just so everyone can hear our docent well. So just you're all muted right now, and so if you could just keep that setting as is, that would be great. If you have any questions or comments during the tour, we absolutely welcome those, and we ask that you put those in the chat box. So at the very bottom of your screen, there's a speech bubble, and underneath that it says chat. And so you can put any questions or comments throughout the lecture. And then at the end, we'll be doing a little Q&A, a question and answer period, and we'll get all of those questions and comments addressed. If you're on Facebook, also, you can join the conversation by putting your questions and comments in the comment section below the video on Facebook. And we'll be monitoring that too, so we can bring you in for the Q&A. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our wonderful docent, Karen, who will be presenting today on the Flemish Baroque. So thank you, Karen.
Thank you very much, Allison. And I really encourage our wonderful audience to ask questions. It's really nice to have a little bit of a dialogue after the presentation, and we always leave a few minutes open for that. So please consider doing that. It's so wonderful. I was just commenting to Allison. It's so wonderful to have two of our Timken masterpieces side by side in this introductory page. We have Peter Paul Rubens on my left, and then, of course, Anthony van Dyck. Which is so interesting, as these are two of the most prominent Flemish painters of that era. Van Dyck, of course, studied in Antwerp with Peter Paul Rubens. We will be talking specifically about these two paintings, but before we begin talking about these two portraits, I want to kind of set the stage for what's happening in the region during this time. And there was a 39-year war that took place between the Spanish Habsburgs and the Dutch Netherlands. Before this time, there was one Flemish region, and it was a contiguous region. And by 1609, it was bifurcated, the Belgian Flemish south and the Northern Dutch north. And what was the main difference between the political differences was the religious differences. The Dutch Calvins, the Dutch Protestants, they were Calvinists and influenced by Lutheran religion. They wanted to create a Protestant country. The Belgian Flemish wanted to stay under the Habsburg rule. They wanted to continue to be Catholic. So this region had to bifurcate in order to be true to their religious and political selves. But it was a time of great unrest. Now, at the time, in the 16th century, before the separation of Holland and Belgium, we will call it Flanders, the Flemish region. Before that, Antwerp was the city of excellence in Europe. Antwerp is on the North Sea. It had a great trading, military. So it was really the top drawer city. However, there was embargoes on that region because of the war between the Spanish Habsburgs for control over Holland, it would be today Holland. So there was embargoes. And so Antwerp started to lose its extreme power and wealth. So what you have is really Amsterdam becomes the quintessential city of the 17th century. One thing I want to point out is Antwerp was really prominent in the development of publishing. In the 16th century, we had the Plantis Moretas family that was producing published works throughout Europe. It would be kind of like the Microsoft of that day. We had people like Peter Paul Rubens, who developed studios and created places for artists to gather and work together. So it was a very dynamic city. As I say, it was a little less so after the separation of Holland and Belgium. I'm going to go ahead and mention that these countries are called the Low Countries. Belgium and Holland, at that time, it was also parts of Luxembourg and France. And these countries were called the Low Countries because 25% of Holland, for example, was below sea level. And along the North Sea, where both cities, Antwerp and Amsterdam, or aligned, it's very either at sea level or below. So that is the name Low Countries. And this is the area that we're going to be focusing on, particularly in the area of the Flemish region, which is today Belgium. Now, one of our early masterpieces is called the Adoration of the Magi. And you know that this theme has been repeated throughout art history. In fact, I'm going to show you, this is a 15th century version, but I'm also going to show you one by Rubens, which is a 17th century version. In this exquisite small painting on panel, we have the Adoration of the Magi. The Persian kings come to greet the infant and pay their respects, so to speak. Now, if you look at it, it reflects Renaissance style. It is a crowded space. We have Caspar in the foreground, looking with a 90-degree angle at the infant Jesus. He does that out of respect. Caspar represents not only one of the Magi, but he also represents the ages of man. He represents the older generation, and he also represents the continent of Europe. This is a very detailed, small painting. You have to remember that the Dutch and Flemish artists, the Netherlandish artists, many of them trained in manuscript illumination. That means they decorated handmade books, because you know it wasn't until the 15th century with Gutenberg that we actually had the movable type and more mass production of books. Before that time, of course, books were handmade and hand decorated. What you have to, as I said, a very crowded space. We get to be front and center to this visitation. To our right, we have 𝗔𝗥𝗧𝗦𝗥𝗲, and he is shown as a Black man who represents not only youth, but the continent of Africa. And Melchior represents middle age and the continent of Asia. We have two servants who one leaves an arch, and then we have someone on the background who is actually viewing the scene. So he's contemporary to that time. Contemporary 15th century figures are looking into a scene of antiquity. And that often is seen throughout art history. Just a couple other things. We have the strawberry plant in the foreground, and that represents the Virgin Mary. She holds about a 6-month-old child, Christ child, and you can see both of them have this gorgeous halo. In the background of the painting, you also see a landscape, emerging landscape, and some architectural elements. One thing you also should notice is the beautiful crimson color. Even though it's a little bit faded, it's a 15th century painting, we have the beautiful red crimson robes, Caspar and Madonna, and she wears the red and blue of her known faith. We have reliquaries, we have beautiful ornamentation. So it's a very exquisite, highly detailed Renaissance painting. I am showing the Renaissance paintings because I want to make some comparisons. I want to show you how art has evolved from the 15th century into the 17th century, which we're going to be focusing on. The next painting is one of our amazing masterpieces, Death of the Virgin by Paetus Christus. Paetus Christus was greatly influenced by the master of Netherlandish painting, Jan van Eyck, who is known with his brother of doing the Adoration of the Lambs in St. Baubles in Ghent. And that's probably one of the greatest Netherlandish altarpieces ever created. I've been very privileged to have visited it twice. It bears repeat visits. The Death of the Virgin was originally a triptych, a 3-panel painting. This is very large, one of the largest paintings known to that Paetus Christus completed. There were side panels that could be closed. However, those were lost during World War II. We're very lucky to have this magnificent center panel. It's quite large. And what do we have? We have 3 episodic activities in the life of the Virgin Mary. Now, this is not a biblical topic. This is from apocryphal literature, stories that were handed down, and they tell about the death of the Virgin. Now, we have some disciples coming to witness this. They gather around her. Some are mourning. You see tears in their eyes, the red-rimmed eyes. You see the Virgin on her deathbed. She holds the candle that relates to her spirituality and Christian faith. Her spirit is rising. You can actually see the metaphorical representation, symbolic representation of the Virgin Mary going up into the realm of God the Father. And he is hovering with angels ready to receive her spirit. On the right, through the open window, you see doubting Thomas on the ground level, waiting to see the verification that the Virgin has passed. And you see an angel holding the belt or girdle of the Virgin Mary to show that, yes, indeed, she has passed. Now, let's talk a little bit more about Patres Christus before we go through a little bit more of the painting. Patres Christus, as I mentioned, was very greatly influenced by the master Jan van Eyck. It is known that he studied the paintings of Jan van Eyck, but he probably did not directly study with him. The one thing that he perpetuated that Jan van Eyck had begun is this development of oil painting. He did not actually originate oil painting, but he began to develop to make it a more jewel-like surface when it was used. One thing that Jan van Eyck and Patres Christus both use is a white background, and they layered upon layer to get this really luminous quality to the paint. And you see a lot of red, that deep crimson, and that partially relates to the Virgin Mary because that was her color, blue and red. You also can notice the perspective. This is single point perspective or 1 point perspective, and that was a gift from Patres Christus. He developed that in the early Renaissance. A couple things you need to notice is it shows his skill as an artist. Not only is he able to contain these figures in an architectural space, but he has a remarkable way of capturing this beautiful landscape. The other thing is, if you notice, there are kind of a funny ovid faces for these prophets and supporters, I should say. They have kind of this ovid face and this very kind of skeletal bodies. Partially that was due to the fact that Northern Renaissance artists were not as taken up with a three-dimensional form as you would find in the Italian Renaissance. It was a colder climate. They were more spiritually motivated, a little less interested in the human body. Remember, Italy is a warm country. It is not so important to be clothed in layers, so there's a little bit more of a chance to sort of study the human body. The other thing is, I want to tell you that Patres Christus was an amazing portrait painter. You only have to go up to the LA County Museum and see a small portrait of a young man that captures the true essence of an individual in a very lifelike way. So this is more about the spiritual realm as opposed to trying to capture a three-dimensional reality. Another masterpiece from the Timken, 𝗔𝗰𝗰𝗰𝗰 by Peter Bruegel. I once was asked if you could take a painting out of the Timken. I would say this is probably one of them. This is, to me, is one of the most beautiful paintings. Now, Peter Bruegel was considered the master of the Northern Renaissance. His focus was landscape. He often did parables and genre paintings, people from his village. Peter Bruegel was a master at painting. He did travel. He traveled to Italy, and Italy was a very inspirational country for many of these Renaissance, and then we're going to go into the Baroque, the topic of this lecture. Of course, I did want to show you some of the predecessors to the artists that we're going to study. But he did travel to Italy, and he did see the Alps. And as I mentioned earlier in the lecture, these are the Low Countries. And so there are no Alps or mountain ranges, but he was so inspired by seeing the Alps that he incorporates this in this aerial perspective. So it's a very interesting perspective that he utilizes, an aerial perspective. Also, something that's very interesting when we study art history, we love to see the delineation of foreground, middle ground, and background. And Bruegel does this in a masterful way. He shows in the foreground a peasant sowing seeds. When you sow seeds, you reap. And of course, that is the parable, the Christian parable, that what you sow, you shall reap. So as the farmer or the peasant farmer sows the seeds for crops, in the background of the painting, we see a cluster of people, very minute cluster of people along the shoreline. We have some boats. And what this represents is Jesus proselytizing. And so the parable is also, what you sow, you shall reap. I beg your pardon. I used my clock to time my talk, and I thought I had turned it off. This happened last time, and I really apologize. So Jesus is proselytizing in the background. Below the Alps, you see a beautiful village also in the background. In the sky is blue, exquisite light. You have to remember that the Renaissance, Northern Renaissance artists and the Italian Renaissance artists and Baroque, they were interested in light. They were interested in the natural world, in particular Bruegel. He loved studying nature. He loved to study the sky. If you can see in the foreground, his representations of trees and branches and the birds are absolutely exquisite. In the very foreground center of the panel, you see a trunk of a tree, very natural. You see a church in the center portion of the painting. And of course, that represents how important Christianity was to these villages. Now, one thing about Bruegel, he did paint both, he was Catholic, but he did paint both Protestant and Catholic themes. Last comment I'd like to make about this painting is the luminous quality, the beautiful, again, this layering of oil paint on panel. It's an exquisite, luminous landscape and allegorical image. Now, I showed you some Renaissance paintings as a prelude to the Baroque. So now we're going to go to the most important Baroque painter in the Flemish region, and that was Peter Paul Rubens. And Rubens was remarkable in so many ways, a real genius. And part of his success, he wasn't born in Antwerp, but Antwerp was where he spent most of his life, although he did spend 8 years in Italy. While he was a young man, he did live in Brussels, and he was kind of apprenticed to a countess. And this countess introduced him to decorum and manners and connected him with very important people in the aristocracy. And he was also a very gifted linguist. He spoke French, he spoke German, Flemish, and I think one other language. So he was a linguist. He was so popular as an artist. He developed a huge studio in Antwerp that you can actually visit today. It's called the Rubens House. And I was been very lucky to have visited, as many of you might have. And it was a beautiful, like an Italian mansion with his studio. And he became very successful. Many of his paintings are collaborations. You will see in a few minutes the work he did with Franz Snijders. He also trained a lot of talented artists. In the beginning of this talk, I mentioned that Anthony van Dyck, another very important Flemish Baroque painter, was his student, a gifted student. He also worked with many others. His studio was large, and he created portraiture, mythological paintings, great altarpieces. One of the most beautiful altarpieces that he completed is in Our Lady of Antwerp. Today, you can see it, a Flemish Baroque, beautiful altarpiece. So he did a lot of religious themes. He worked for the Spanish court. Remember, the Habsburgs did control this region post 1609 and before, but he was allowed to work in Antwerp. The last thing I want to say is he did work for the Gonzaga and Medici court. Some people, and he did the Medici cycles, but I will also say that some people allege that he was a spy. Some say that he was just a court gentleman who traveled throughout Europe. He went to Spain, he went to Italy, but others say he actually had some interesting kind of espionage trips. So quickly, we'll just look at this beautiful trony. A trony is, even though it is a portrait of a young man in uniform, this perhaps was a trony, a painting that would be used on a larger scaled painting. It's kind of like when you're doing something on the computer and you want to pull an image to be placed in a larger setting. This is what a trony would be. So perhaps he thought he would use this for later historical painting, mythological painting. So this young man looks at us with confidence, those tousled curls, that very gestural style. If you notice, if you look at the Renaissance paintings are more classically conceived. They're more geometric in format. This is more reminiscent of this Baroque, very much on the diagonal, very dramatic, light-filled. Remember, Rubens spent time in Italy and he knew the work of Caravaggio. So you can see that this light falls on the armor. You can see the three-dimensionality of the armor. You can see his eyes look with confidence, that beautiful smile, that aquiline nose, and the very gestural, plain background. So his armor, very well done. That crimson cloak lets us know he's a person of substance. But again, we don't really know specifically who it is because it was meant to be used perhaps in other paintings. Another work by Rubens is done a little later. This is in Munich, The Lion Hunt. Now, when Rubens was a young man and he was under the mentorship of this countess, this rich woman, he often would read books on travels and exotic people and creatures. And so he kind of took this to heart. The other thing is you have to remember that at this time, during the Baroque era, Holland and Belgium were very well-traveled countries with well-traveled ships and navies. And so particularly in Holland, there was a lot of travel into more exotic ports, to North Africa, for example, even to the colonies in America. So there was a lot of exotic travel, and that also influences this painting. Now, I believe that Franz Schneider's, I can't see if it's written here, but I also believe that Franz Schneider's helped with this painting, and he did the horses. Now, what is happening in this, oh my gosh, kind of gruesome, dramatic, light-filled, motion-filled, very Baroque painting? Well, these men are attempting to hunt the lions. Well, that isn't going really well. The lions are actually revolting and going against the hunters. So you actually see these men getting maimed and torn apart and perhaps even dying, as you see on the right foreground. One soldier seems to, he's in some type of headdress, so we assume it's some kind of soldier. We see someone insisting him, trying to stab, not so successfully. The lion is clawing the skin of the man. In the left foreground, we see somebody with a shield trying to stab the lion. Things are not going very well. And ironically enough, we actually have, with all this dynamic action and vivid colors and light, particularly on the left diagonal of the paintings, we also see a beautiful landscape emerge. And so you can see the true brilliance of Rubens. He was able to, the human form he did brilliantly, this landscape in the background. He could also do horses and animals, but as I say, perhaps Schneider's assisted him. As I mentioned, he did mythological paintings, historical paintings, religious paintings, the aristocracy. He was a very multi-talented artist. I think we have one more painting. Yes, the Adoration of the Magi. Now, I think earlier I said that you will see quite a difference in what is happening in this Magi as opposed to the one I showed you earlier. So I'm just going to do a quick repeat if you just give me a second. I just want to show you how different the evolution. So here we have last quarter of the 15th century, like 150 years later, how different, how more three-dimensional and a little more realistic, perhaps. We have this. Now, what Peter Paul Rubens is depicting here, not only a religious theme, he was a Catholic, but he also is commemorating this treaty that occurs in 1608 in Antwerp. And what is happening is the Spanish Habsburg delegation is welcoming the Dutch regents because they want to sign a treaty. They want to end this 39-year war. They want Antwerp to become more vital and Holland to keep its Protestant political and religious beliefs. So it does commemorate not only religious theme, but it also commemorates this signing of a treaty. I do want to just comment a little bit about this painting. This theme has been done so many times in Renaissance and Baroque art, and you'll see so many variations. And as I mentioned, Rubens shows all his skill as an artist. He incorporates animals and putti in the upper register of the painting. We have architectural, we have a column and an overhang. We have light just streaming, the Caravaggio-esque light that streams onto the Christ child. And as we see the Magi and supporters and the community comes to witness this beautiful scene. It's very fanciful, it's kind of mystical. You see the bright stars, that swirling sky. You can almost see how, even though this is Flemish and not Dutch, but you can almost see how Van Gogh might have been inspired for Starry Night with this beautiful sky and the luminous quality. Look at the beautiful colors, the paint, the jewel tones. So we very much have quite a different evolved depiction of the Magi. Now, I want to move on to talk a little bit about another great Flemish painter, and this is Anthony van Dyck. Van Dyck studied with Rubens. He was one of his students, and Van Dyck too traveled to Italy, but he spent a lot of time in England. In fact, eventually he became court painter to Charles I. He originally worked for some other royal families, and he did also work for the Villiers family. And I will talk about that in just a moment. Anthony van Dyck is shown here in sort of a pinkish suit of clothing, for want of a better term, and the light falls in a really beautiful way on the left side of the painting. Again, he knew Italian painters, obviously Caravaggio, for example, because Caravaggio was a master of light. Now, this is a self-portrait where he looks at us. Why does he do a self-portrait? Well, of course, artists, particularly Rembrandt, for example, did many, many versions of his life through portraiture. Why do they do it? Of course, as I say, to document their life, but also because you practice your craft by doing your own portrait. The odd and sad thing about this is he looks and points at the sunflower. Now, a sunflower doesn't have as deep of a meaningful connection as some other flowers, but it does represent fidelity, that you are very true to someone or something. And he points to the sunflower because he wants to show that he's true to Charles I. Kind of a, let's say, sort of a little bit of obsequious, if it not. He also points to the sunflower as the sunlight shines on the sunflower. So as the sunflower grows because of the sun, Van Dyck grows because of his patronage. The other thing that sunflowers represent is longevity. Sadly, he did not die a very old man. Van Dyck lived to, I believe, 42. So that was a little, an interesting little sub-comment. He has a gold chain in his hand. And the gold chain, which actually has a medallion, which is kind of covered by his hand, was given to him by Charles I. So he wanted to make sure that he honors all the support that Charles I gave him. So the colors are exquisite. We have a very dark background, and that is very common in the Flemish Baroque, just like the Spanish Baroque. They use a lot of these very dark monochromatic backgrounds. You see some gestures, although you see some very finite painterly qualities in this painting. They love these jewel tones. They love to capture sort of the exquisite layering of the oil paint and the light. And you can see that Van Dyck beard and mustache, and it was named after him. Now, lastly, I want to point out that he was very popular in the English court because he flattered his subjects. He was known to be a masterful portrait painter, and people really liked the outcome of his paintings. So with that said, this is Mary Villiers, Lady Herbert of Sherland, and she was the daughter of his very dear friend and one of his original patrons, Villiers, and she is shown as an exquisite but very, very sad young 14-year-old. Well, let's talk a little bit about it. As I said, he captured these figures so beautifully. You can see the exquisite gold gown, the luminescent pearls, her bright eyes, but you can even see the veins in her hands. And remember, if you've heard some of my talks, I always concentrate on hands, really one of the hardest things for an artist to depict. Now, she's 14, but she's a widow. Wow. You have to recall that in those days, and if you were a member of the upper classes, and you were joining great wealth and partnerships, you often married very young. So she's already been widowed at 14. She holds a flower, and the flower is a metaphorical reference. Remember, the Dutch and Flemish very much incorporated these memento mores in their paintings, particularly in the vanitas paintings of still lives, which always symbolizes a deeper meaning. And if you think about it, flowers represent the cycle of life. You pick a flower, it's a little bud, it's like youth. The flower begins to open as middle age continues, and then we have the falling petals of old age. And so her flower represents not only her youth, but as it kind of is waning, it shows representation of her death, probably the death of her husband, probably from smallpox. She wears black ribbons, of course, as we mentioned, that she is a widow. And someone once asked, well, why isn't she fully in black? Well, because they did not want her to lose the opportunity later in her life to remarry. Look at the exquisite pearls that Van Dyck paints in this portrait. And the pearls, as I've told you in the past, were the bling of this era, Renaissance and Baroque, and even into the Rococo. So you were wearing a lot of bling. That actually gives you a window on how people dress and what was fashionable, and also what was considered sort of for the aristocracy. Her hair is delicately curled. She does have a sadness about her. She confronts us, but she confronts us with a sadness. Her skin is very pale. Her gown, you can see the folds of the gown as it's pushed up close to her elbows. Just a masterful portrait, very detailed. I'm going to go on to back to Rubens and Franz Snijders. Franz Snijders was, as I mentioned, the most gifted animal painter during the Flemish Baroque. And he was a collaborator with Rubens. So of course he definitely deals with creating this eagle, that just magnificent eagle. I wanted to mention that in this painting of Prometheus, who was a Titan who gave fire to man, and I will say that Zeus was not too happy about it. And so he condemned poor Prometheus to a life of terror, being that for eternity, he would have his liver pecked out by this eagle as he hung from a stone cliff. Just a horrendous, terrible death in perpetuity. Now, if you look at this twisted, massive, muscular form, you have to kind of remember that he went to Italy, as I mentioned, and he studied the work of the Laocoon, that magnificent Hellenistic sculpture. And so that twisted body with not a serpent as in Laocoon, but with this eagle, this vicious eagle that's pecking at his flesh. He used that twisting format for good old Prometheus. This story comes from Greek playwrights. Aeschylus wrote about this. And so that is the story, although the Titans, of course, were and Zeus in Greek mythology. What you see is the exquisite capturing of the exquisite bird, the twisted muscular form, very three-dimensional. You can see that he studied a lot of Roman antiquities and sculpture. The landscape is also in the background and along the horizon line, a little lower horizon line, absolutely beautiful with the clouds. As the light falls on Prometheus, you see the terror on his face, you see the claws clutching his face, very painful. And again, as I mentioned, that diagonal format really enhances that Baroque style and tension and dynamic form. So we're going to talk a little bit about just Franz Snyder's for a second, and we're going to go into the realm of still life painting. This is called the Pantry, as you can see, 1620. And Snyder's wasn't quite as capable as Rubens, for example, or Van Dyck, of capturing the human form, but he was a master in animal forms. So this pantry shows the abundance of fruit and vegetables and animals that would be used for a very affluent household. We have all kinds of things happening. Now, this is a very horizontal painting. You don't see quite as much verticality, but we do see the hanging animals. We have what's called a roebuck, a type of deer, and it's hanging with its viscerae out. We have a swan, a beautiful swan. We have a lobster. We have pheasants and fruit and salmon steaks and rabbits and all kinds of vegetables in the right foreground, asparagus and cauliflower, masterfully done. We have a plate of eels in the foreground on a silver dish, and we have oysters. Now, there's a little bit of a comedic realm to this painting, because we have, if you look at the right middle ground, we have a dog trying to pull, which looks like maybe a crab or a quail or something. I can't quite make it out, but he's trying to pull it, and he's sort of gingerly looking around to see if he's going to get caught. And then there is a cat in the center foreground, a little bit in this, I'm sorry, I can't point to it, but where that silver plate of the eel, there's a cat trying to snatch one. So that's kind of a little clever little story behind this. The other thing is that it is probably noted that he might have been representing a couple things. With all these natural objects, you know, the lobster from the sea and the oysters, and then the vegetables from the earth, and the animals from you know, and birds from the sky. So he's actually looking at you know, the four: earth, wind, water, and fire, and perhaps the senses too, because we can almost smell the ripening fruit, those jewel-like tones in the basket. We see how the woman looks to this abundance. So you have to also think that the Flemish Baroque, in terms of still lives, or this is actually a pantry with still lives, you have to remember that the Flemish were not middle-class Protestants as much as they were Catholics, and many of them still had, with this aristocratic kind of realm of the Spanish Habsburgs. And so you often see these still lives done by the Flemish a little more opulent, reflecting on just this bounty. So this is a pantry showing a couple of other things I just want to point out. There's some, quote, memento mori in this, in that we have obviously death, but we also have things like the lobster and the oysters. Now, the oysters represent sometimes sensuality, and also we have the swan that relates to, you know, swans mate for life, and that's kind of a reference to that. Just quickly too, I want to point out in the left background, you see also this exquisite landscape. They were very interested in bringing the natural world, whether it's by animals, fruit and vegetables, or just a snippet of the landscape. Now, we're going to go to the work of Ozias Baert. And Ozias Baert was one of the most gifted still life painters. And I am just mesmerized by these Dutch and Flemish still life paintings. So of course the Dutch had their own amazing repertoire of still lifes, and some of these artists actually incorporated some of the stylistic concerns back and forth. Of course, as I mentioned, they were very influenced by the Italians. But let's take a look at this beautiful still life. The Flemish still life paintings often incorporated exquisite objects. We see these very delicate, beautiful goblets of the silver reliquary, maybe containing spices. We see it also a silver plate with these magnificent oysters, a plate of olives. I believe those are figs. And then we have some what look to be, could be a couple things. It could be chocolates mirroring seashells. I'm not 100% sure because I've looked at this many times and I'm not sure if it's just seashells or a confection that was meant to look like a seashell. Probably the most beautiful element of this painting is the glass to the left, the glass of perhaps champagne. And you see the light that falls exquisitely on this glass. Just like the Dutch, the Flemish painters of the Baroque were inspired by light and realism. These are like hyper real. You can almost see a photographically real element to this painting. You have a very interesting configuration, sort of a decorative element to this, also probably a reliquary. You have a little sculptural element on the top. You see these oysters and they look so real. And what's remarkable, he has a hard shell, but within the shell is this translucent sort of liquid oyster. You see the light that shines on the silver piece that probably contains spices. You can see the little holes at the top. You can actually see like a little creatures that were decorative elements. And then of course this exquisite light reflected on the element on the right. Now, again, both the Flemish and the Dutch artists in the Baroque would often have these elements of allegory or metaphor. So we call those vanitas paintings. Those objects would probably be like a memento mori, memento of death. Some of the more overt ones might be a skull, for example, an hourglass. Here it's a slightly more subtle. What we see is wine and champagne, and that also relates to like the bubbles, the ephemeral nature of life. We have the citrus, but we have a fly on it, could represent decay. As I mentioned earlier, sometimes oysters relate to sensuality. So there's often many references to be studied in these paintings. Just really quickly, I love the austere black background. It definitely highlights the beauty of this painting. And I see that I'm going a little slowly, so I'm going to go a little more quickly. This is a still life of breakfast with the champagne glass, a breakfast scene. And now you might say, what? Champagne at breakfast? Well, if you've heard some of my other talks, you know that the Dutch and Flemish people often drank some kind of alcoholic beverage this was actually the late breakfast. 𝗔𝗥𝗧𝗦𝗥𝗲 was probably one of the greatest still life painters of that era. He did masterful floral still lifes, and of course, this exquisite champagne breakfast. Now, this is built up into a triangular form. And 𝗔𝗥𝗧𝗦𝗥𝗲 was just a master at doing this. And look at the beauty, the translucent pomegranates, the grapes, which refer to the Eucharist and, refer to Christ in the Eucharist. We have an overturned glass. That is a reminder that when everything is beautiful, things can turn. So there's always this understanding that of the ephemeral nature of life. We also have not only an overturned glass, but we have a twisted cord. And that might be a reference to the Garden of Eden. And what it refers to is that things that are not always savory or perfect can come into beautiful spaces. Again, look at that exquisite Venetian glass with the champagne and little tiny bubbles. Again, ephemeral nature of life. We have the citrus, and the citrus can represent a couple things. It can represent exotic fruit and vegetables that come from other countries. It can also be something that is bitter, sometimes life is bitter. And it also references the lobster, that sometimes it would be an enhancement for that. Again, those beautifully done oysters, just like our 𝗔𝗥𝗧𝗦𝗥𝗲. The oysters represent sensuality often, and you see, again, that hard shell and the sort of liquidy form of the oyster. And it's just about, and those grapes, just like you want to just pluck those grapes. I was reading some references to this painting, and someone was commenting, it would just be such a, I know it's a little early, but just thinking about just what a beautiful spread, the lobster and the champagne and the crusty bread. This is so realistic. It's just capturing this moment in such a perfect manner. And of course, that diagonal, the pipe and the swirling form of the rope or twine just gives us some sort of dynamic quality to the painting. 𝗔𝗥𝗧𝗦𝗥𝗲 did a lot, he was Catholic, he did a lot of Catholic themes. And this garland format is very particular to Belgium. They really created it. And what you have here is a very religious painting. You have a form in the center, a goblet, chalice, as it were, with a religious sort of Catholic light that forms. You have the wheat of the Eucharist. Also, the format of the garland relates to Christianity. And you have all manner of fruit and vegetables. As I said, the wheat of the Eucharist. It might be, if you look closely, you might see some insects. Some of them have positive connotation. For example, butterflies and caterpillars, the movement of life. If you see animals interacting with each other, it also talks about trauma and death. But we have all manner of beautiful flora. And the other thing is, again, this light, as the chalice is in the niche, chalice, I'm sorry, is in the niche, the light just shines on it. And then you have this half in shadow and half in light. And the same with the fruits and vegetables, very detailed in some points and also a little bit more obscure. Because of time, I'm going to move on and just show you a little bit of the work of Jan Bruegel the Elder. Now, the Bruegel family was just so talented. We have Peter Bruegel the Younger, of course, Peter Bruegel the Elder, who we saw in the very beginning with the parable of the sower. But we have Jan Bruegel the Elder, who was the second son, Peter Bruegel the Younger, who was the oldest. Peter Bruegel was about 5 or 6 when his father died. Jan Bruegel didn't really know his father very well, but he was very influenced by his work and that of his brothers. They used to call this Bruegel, Jan Bruegel, Velvet Bruegel, because if you look, you can almost feel the sort of the velvety background. You see something like 31 flowers represented here. Just like the Dutch, the Flemish artists were captivated by flowers. As you know, the Dutch suffered from tulipomania, this obsession with tulips that came from Turkey, hence the name tulip, turban. You can see some tulips, some variegated tulips in the middle ground or background of the painting. You see irises, chrysanthemums, roses, peonies, gladiola. I could just name, there's 31 flowers represented. Now, that is not really a true still life in that none of these, I shouldn't say that, many of these flowers would not be in bloom at the same time. I know that I'm starting to see irises growing in my front garden, but many of these other flowers would be, the lilies, for example, would not necessarily be growing at the same time. We also have some butterfly and salamander, and a reference to life and death. And some of these flowers are sort of fading. We also have some wheat of the Eucharist, if I'm not mistaken. And instead of a beautiful glass container or vase, we have a very rudimentary wooden vessel, which is quite nicely done with the light shining on it. Again, I'm going to move a little more quickly. I wanted to show you some of these genre paintings and parables. So this is the Drunkard on an Egg by Peter Bruegel the Younger, the son of Peter Bruegel. And this painting is pretty remarkable. you must be able to tell that he, like his father, was greatly influenced by Hieronymus Bosch. In fact, to such a degree that they used to call him 𝗏𝗏𝗰𝗵, because unlike his brother Jan Bruegel, who captured beautiful still lifes and flowers and glassware, Peter Bruegel was fascinated by hell and creatures and the peasants. And so he often depicts this kind of behavior in these parables. Now, what does it represent? Well, it's a drunkard, and he's trying to hatch an egg, but he doesn't realize that they're just like this mannequin in the egg. So his activity is pretty futile. He looks like he's a little bit confused. But one thing we just have to look at is how gorgeous the landscape is. And of course, his father was a masterful landscape painter. However, he wasn't as fine a landscape painter as his father. His father's brushstrokes are more refined. Although this is a paler palette in this tondo, a round formatted painting. If you look at the next painting, which we're going to see in just a second, you'll see a much more bold and dramatic style. So it is a tondo. It represents, a parable about alcohol consumption and a little bit of the peasant class. So we'll move on to this St. John the Baptist. Now, St. John the Baptist was actually Jewish. He was a great prophet. He was killed by Herod for his beliefs, but he was very revered, not only in Christianity, but in the Muslim faith and other traditions, Baha'i faith. So he was a very important figure to many religions. He was sacrificed by Herod for his beliefs because he was trying to speak the truth to these townspeople. And so he was beheaded. So it was a terrible way to die. So if you look at the palette of Peter Bruegel the Younger, you see a much more dynamic use of color. As I mentioned, however, his father, the great landscape painter, you can even see a quote from his father's painting in the middle to background of the painting. If I were to go back, and I'm going to do it just because it's really important to compare in art history, I'm going to go back for a second and just show you where he takes that quote. Excuse me. As you can see, it mirrors some of the work of his father. So we'll go back. And what's also interesting is a comment that I actually made to you earlier, in that it's interesting how religious figures are incorporated in the life of a 17th century peasant group. So we see the peasants, like his father, he liked to show the peasant class. Sometimes he did more upper class, but these are the peasants listening with just a strong attention. We see animals, we see people hanging from the trees. Everybody's trying to capture a moment so they can hear what John the Baptist is preaching. Now, really quickly, I just have a few more before we have a minute to, a few minutes to have questions. This is David Teniers. And David Teniers was an amazing painter. He traveled to Italy, and he was very, very influenced by Italian Renaissance and Baroque painting. If you look carefully, there's works by Titian, Veronese, Giorgione. So he really studied the work of these Italian masters. A very important element to this painting, it is of Leopold. And Leopold was an archduke of the Spanish court, and he hired Teniers to be a court painter. And so Teniers captures his patron. Now, when I say captures his patron, what the Archduke wanted to show in this painting is, first of all, himself. He's in the tall black hat, and he wants to show himself, look, I'm this amazing patron. I collect art. I am a patron of the arts. And David Teniers is very happy about this, and he's actually shown holding some drawings in the my left-hand corner. So he is the farthest left, that is the artist himself. And you also have a back door open. What's really interesting about this painting is he inspired, I have to remember if I have this correct. This was an inspiration for from Las Meninas, the painting by Velázquez. So Velázquez also used that format of an open door. I'm sorry, he took that from Velázquez. I hope I made that clear. So we see all these beautiful, even some Spanish Baroque paintings. We see the crest of the Archduke. We see many, many salon style paintings. We have the little lapdogs in the foreground. And you just, Ganymede also is shown as a sculptor. And Ganymede was he was a he was a Trojan, and Zeus used him for some types of activities. And so you also see a sculpture of him. I see Allison is getting ready. I just wanted to really quickly, this is David Tener's family. He's playing a music, just cello. His family is gathering, wine is cooling. They're getting ready to listen to the music. We have a little monkey pushing the finial over. So that sort of represents some style of humor. This is Jacob Jordan's, probably the most important capture of the peasant class. We see the celebration of the Epiphany, where the oldest of the family would be given the honor of being the center stage, the king. But this is really remarking on debauchery. Jacob Jordan's was loath to the drinking, which is even mentioned in the top little plaque up there. And lastly, this is Adrian Brouwer, who is probably the most important painter of peasants, and he is showing a portrait of himself. This is a remarkable capturing of the human face. It's his own face. So I'm going to have to move on to our questions. I only missed a couple, so usually I run way over and I have several paintings to show. But anyway, Allison, do we have any questions?
Great, thank you so much, Karen. We can all give her kind of a virtual round of applause. Thank you for taking us through all of that. Yes, if you have any questions, our audience, please, you can either unmute yourself or you can go ahead and write them in the chat. Excuse me, I know sometimes it takes a second to write your question in the chat, so maybe I'll get us started with a question that you kind of hinted at throughout your talk, but could you kind of sum up how we can classify the Flemish Baroque as opposed to the Baroque in other countries at this time?
That is a great question, absolutely great question. I think the closest thing I can do is compare it to the Dutch. The reason why is because it shows how the Catholic faith and the control by the Spanish Habsburgs, actually the Spanish Habsburgs did not leave Belgium until about 1700. So their aristocratic Catholic realm was very influential. So what you have more is, you don't have as many religious paintings. Yes, Rembrandt painted religious paintings, but it was the Protestant ethos. So you have more middle class, more genre paintings in the Dutch. You have more still life for still life's sake. Not that they didn't have the memento mori, but it's more about decorating your home, showing the very comfortable middle class. Like, for example, Frans Hals, he captures sort of the burghers, whereas the Flemish would be more ornate, more a little more decorative. Catholic iconography and themes would be found. So one is more sort of the a little more a kind of aristocratic and decorative, and one is more kind of Protestant and more sort of middle class. Does that help?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think we do see, I think kind of like you said, like there's some overlap. You see like some influence from one another, but it's definitely its own distinct style, even though sometimes we do classify them together. So like in the Timken, we have the Dutch Flemish gallery, but it's nice when we can kind of break them down and really look at the differences between these two.
Absolutely, because before the 15th century, that whole region, the Netherlandish region, really didn't have its own stylistic concern. It was very influenced by the French, for example. But eventually, because of this separation, and this also a really big point I forgot to mention is this Counter-Reformation. They want to show the importance of the Catholic Church. So that is pervasive in Belgian art. I didn't show you as many religious paintings, so that's why it didn't come up as earlier on.
Yeah, it was a good mix. Yeah. Yeah. Do we have any other questions from the audience? Like I said, I don't see any in the chat. So if you want to just unmute yourself, maybe someone would like to just ask a question out loud.
We love questions.
And I'm looking on Facebook as well if anyone there wants to ask a question in the comments.
I have a question.
Please.
the one that's on my screen right now, the Villers lady that was 14.
Sure.
When I first looked at this, I, not knowing, before you spoke, but just looking at this, she looks to me like she's with child, the way he's painted. She's very bloused out in that area, and she's small on top, and then she's, blossoming. But I'm assuming, and now that I know she's a widow, that she's not with child.
That's a great point. She is not with a child, but if you look stylistically, a lot of this Netherlandish, especially the Arnolfini portrait by Jan van Eyck done in the 15th century, it also looks like in this marriage portrait that the woman is pregnant, very small on top and kind of, but part of it is just this billowing dress. So you see this satin fabric that just yards of fabric, and it really just is revealing just the kind of decadence of the clothing. But she was of the upper classes. So no, good question, good observation. She's not pregnant.
That's a good thing.
At that age,
yeah, that's a good thing.
I had a question.
Please.
So, Karen, I thought that the painting by Jacob Jordaens, is that how you say his last name?
Yeah, Jordaens, yeah.
The King Drinks.
Yes.
Okay, I just was flabbergasted to see that woman holding her child on her lap with like the wiping the baby's bottom, and I thought, what is that supposed to signify?
Oh, okay. I want to tell you, we didn't even get a chance to look at. There were so many kind of disgusting elements. There was a woman or man vomiting in the painting, and the thing is, Jordan's was really hated alcohol, and what he's commenting on is how ridiculous people appear when they drink to excess. And actually at the top, that placard says something to that effect, like the greatest fools are drunkards. And so if you look closely, I know we just had a moment. So the oldest member of the family is the king. He's got the crown. He's being celebrated. And he's, acting within the realm of, I guess, acceptability. But, people are over consuming, they're drinking, they're not even being respectful of the other people, like the baby's bottom. It just shows he's showing the basest behavior of the peasant class. And of course, the aristocracy drank to excess too. That is something we should also remember. But he wants to show sort of the depravity of these peasants under the overconsumption of alcohol. So it's really a moral tale. They very much are moralizing. But yeah, specifically, there's not, that baby, I know, it takes you aback a little bit.
It's front and center.
Yeah, front and center.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Kind of a similar message to the drunkard on the egg, which was another sort of shocking in this one.
Exactly, like he's trying to hatch a marionette in a broken egg. I mean, it's really silly. And of course, it's also a reference to Hieronymus Bosch, because Bosch often showed the worst elements of human nature.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's going to do it. I'm looking and I don't see any other written comments. We do have a couple people saying thank you. It was fascinating. They really enjoyed it. So thank you, Karen. I'm going to echo that as well. I enjoyed it as well. And I want to let our audience know that we do these every month. So maybe you've come to some in the past. If this is your first one, welcome. We have one next month on Wednesday, May 19th at 11 a.m. And that one will be on 19th century American art. And as a reminder, these lectures are kind of going beyond our collection. So we include some like you see on screen, but then we also bring in a lot of others from museums across the world. And then every Thursday at 11 a.m. So every single week, we do more focused tours on our own collection. So if you're not familiar with the Timken Museum, that would be a great place to start those 11 a.m. Thursday lectures, because you can really get to know our collection. And Karen actually has one tomorrow at 11 a.m. So if you enjoyed her today, yep, you can come tomorrow at 11 a.m. also on Zoom.
But that one I'm going to do, it's not as thematic, it's more highlights. And so hopefully you can all join us. And I really appreciate our audience tuning in, and of course, all the work that Allison does. So until next time, I will see you then, I hope. Thank you again, Allison.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.